Welcome back to the OPEX podcast. On today's episode, I am joined once again by Dr. Jeoff Drobot. On this episode, Jeff and I discuss adrenal fatigue, facts and fallacies. Guys, this is a great episode with Jeff. It's jam-packed full of information. Enjoy. Jeff, thanks so much for making time. You Ukrainian beauty, you.
Still, I'd like to throw a little bit. Maybe there's some Russian mixed in that, but I'd like to say I'm purebred Ukrainian. Not even sure if that used to be a joke in elementary. People like you're Ukrainian, and now it just means we're strong people. We're strong people, yeah. Robbie.
I don't. Do you think the Russians will let you in?
You know what? I'll tell you a funny story. Actually, there was a machine there. I'm a big into tech. And I tried to go back to my homeland, maybe Ukraine or Russia. I was going to pick up this machine, and I was only going to fly there for a day. And I think the customs guys were like, no bloody way you're flying here to pick up this weird machine. So I had to divert and go to Greece, Cyprus, go pick up this piece of technology I needed for my clinic and fly back in a day. So apparently the last name didn't mean anything, and they didn't want to see my heritage back there. So whatever, right? I guess I'll return. I'll make my return, Robbie. Don't worry. Triumphantly, I will make my return back to the Ukraine.
What was this mysterious machine you were getting? Was it the DeLorean or something? Was it?
I wish it was. I wish it was a time machine. But actually, it was a piece of bioresonance device that the Russians are really good at frequency. They always have been in pulse electromagnetic fields, and they built some beautiful technology over there. And way better than I used to go to Europe to get this, but there was one piece of machinery that I wanted to, but we flew it to Cyprus anyways. Let's put it that way. And back we go.
All right, we'll stay on point here today because I'm as my mother says my mother has a famous "you're a devil." You know,
we can drift.
I'm a devil for getting off point here. So we'll digress here. Topic for today is adrenal fatigue, if there is such a thing, so I kind of, tongue-in-cheek sent you the email saying adrenal fatigue, fact or fiction or fact or fallacies. So I just want you to wrap on this topic. When you hear the term adrenal fatigue, what comes to mind? And maybe kind of, again, separate what is fact from fiction. And as I said to you before we hopped online, probably a good thing to do, just to lay a bit of groundwork for the listeners, is, what are the adrenals? Where are they in the body? What do they do? Why are they important to know? And then we can kind of divulge into like what's actually fact and what's actual fiction when it comes to this thing called adrenal fatigue, if there is such a thing.
Right. So, I mean, this has been circling the drain of alternative versus conventional medicine for a long period of time. Actually, all hormones really have been circulating the drain of conventional versus alternative medicine for some time, because in the world of endocrinology, I mean, you either have it or you don't. There's not a gradient to say that they might be low or they might be high. It's either disease or it's not disease. So adrenal glands they're little endocrine glands that sit on top of the kidneys like little hats, and they have two functions. One is to produce basically neurochemistry, which is adrenaline. That's how people know it. They say, well, the adrenal glands, I want adrenaline, and that's one function of the adrenal glands. And then there's a hormonal component of the adrenal glands that produce hormones like pregnenolone, cortisol, DHEA, and then we have some other ones like aldosterone that really people don't know about, that regulate water retention. But primarily in this discussion, we say, can you produce where the mix gets? Everybody can produce adrenaline. I mean, you drink a cup of coffee in the morning, it's a stimulant. Everybody can understand that. So they understand the component of adrenaline. They just don't understand. I think the mix gets in there when we start talking about the endocrinology aspect, where we say, what are the hormonal outputs of an adrenal gland? These tiny little guys that sit on top of the kidneys, do they matter? I mean, do they have different times a day that they do things? And if you have them, I mean, they must work. So in medicine, I mean, the problem is cortisol is always looked at as the only adrenal hormone we're ever going to talk about. And so you can hear this. People that say adrenal fatigue are like, well, look, that's very hard to have complete adrenal fatigue from a medical standpoint, because it means your ass would be planted on the bed, which can happen, and you'd have no cortisol. And so how you produce cortisol is you have a pituitary gland. It gets an input. Pituitary glands are in your head. If you're under stress, your chemistry is going to say to your pituitary gland, can you give me some stress hormone? If you're hurt, the same thing. It's going to go to your pituitary gland and say, can you produce some anti-inflammatory hormone? Both of those, stress and anti-inflammatory hormones, they have the last name cortisol. So we know that because if you have a hurt shoulder and we put an injection of cortisone into the shoulder, it's an anti-inflammatory and the pain goes away, and that's looked at as a treatment. Where we kind of miss it is we say, well, if they only produce adrenaline and cortisol and you can get out of your bed and you can do stuff, then you must not have adrenal fatigue. And then the other component is what happens, there's a catabolic portion, which means a breaking down portion of the adrenal gland, which is that cortisol. So what's the anabolic portion of the adrenal gland? And that's a little hormone called DHEA. Right. So DHEA with cortisol basically is the fire. DHEA would be the water. So if you produce cortisol, you also want to produce DHEA. And DHEA is the other hormone coming out of the adrenal gland that is essentially an anti-aging anabolic hormone. That's why it's banned in Olympic sports. And it's actually, you cannot get it in Canada because it will not cross the border. So you cannot get cortisol either because it is a hormone that we strictly use in medicine. So to clarify, we'll say we have this fight or flight part of the nervous system that's called adrenaline. And then we have a longer acting hormonal component, which is really cortisol and DHEA. So then it leads us into this discussion that we're going to have. If we can test it and you have a little bit of cortisol, you essentially don't have Addison's disease or true adrenal fatigue, right? That would mean you have zero, which would mean technically either something outrageous has gone on with your adrenal gland or your pituitary is just not talking to it. On the other side, medically, we'll say if you have too much cortisol, it's called Cushing's disease. And Cushing's disease, which you wouldn't be able to do just on your own with a ton of stress, you would actually have to have something that's pathologically causing your adrenal gland to secrete too much cortisol. And that's where we leave it in endocrinology. It's either none or way too much. And then we have this huge playing field, which now we'll talk about, that says, what happens if I stress this gland and it's unable to respond? Or what happens if I stress this gland and it doesn't ever relax? Then where does it go? Because we all know what goes up must come down. So if I'm going to go ahead and be under chronic mental emotional stress or chronic physical training, what does that look like at the end of the day? Because we know cortisols are very, very important. They break digestive tracts down in order to provide resources for skeletal muscles because they're basically a fight or flight hormone. If I'm going to be in a fight, I'm going to go ahead and sacrifice some resources so I can get away from that lion. So cortisol's job is, look, I'm going to raise blood sugar. I'm going to rip the digestive tract down so I can provide more resources for the brain and skeletal muscles. And then hopefully you're going to get away from that lion. You're going to go to sleep. I'm going to produce some other hormones so that I can get back to normal. When that doesn't happen, then we have dysfunction. And it's very strange in endocrinology because we talk about this and we say, well, it either has a yes or a no, right? It doesn't have a maybe. Right? There's no maybe. So people get stuck in this and it's like, well, every other hormone has a maybe. Either you produce too much insulin or no insulin, but then what's insulin? What's type 2 diabetes, right? Like what? We have insulin, you're just not responding to it. That's a maybe. What happens in testosterone? Either we castrate or we have way too much testosterone. There's not low testosterone. There's no differentiation of testosterone. There's no maybe in testosterone. And so we kind of get into this discussion with adrenal glands where we say it's yes, no, maybe. And then we don't really then pay attention to like, what's the circadian rhythm of the hormone? If it's high all the time, is that good? Does that mean the gland is functioning? If it's not high all the time or low all the time, does that mean the gland is not functioning? And it's like, look, like everything has a rhythm and we can go ahead and strain anything. If I take my right bicep and I do nothing but curls all day, every day, trust me, I still have a bicep. It still functions, but it's going to atrophy. There comes a time where I cannot replace what I've broken down. And that leads us into this deep, dark world of how do we test these adrenal glands? What does it mean when it's high? What does it mean when it's low? And then what do I have to do to get them back to normal so that they respond? We don't need high cortisol. We don't need low cortisol. We simply need adrenal glands that respond to stress, then they get repaired, and then they produce it, especially for females, because everybody says, well, females don't have testicles, so they don't need adrenal glands. It's like, that's the only place they produce testosterone. I'm not sure with the female athlete why we're not supposed to be measuring cortisols, DHEAs, and testosterone if we want to get any response, because that's really one of the only glands that's going to produce testosterone if we want a training effect. So I know everybody goes round the bend and says, well, adrenals, but it's a true story. You know, we know that even if we look in the world of detoxification, if we don't have anti-inflammatory cortisol, you know, we get into trouble. If we look in the world of immunology, if we don't have cortisol, we get into trouble. We're more susceptible to infection. If we get into the world of training, if we don't have cortisol, we degenerate our joints. You know, this is easy to test now. I'm not even sure why we're still having a discussion. Why we're still saying, well, we only test blood cortisol, and then we do something called an ACTH test that says, well, if your pituitary is producing ACTH, which is it's like a little signaler that goes and kicks the adrenal glands in the butt and says produce cortisol. And they're like, see, I gave you ACTH and we can squeeze some cortisol out of your adrenal glands, so technically your adrenal glands are fine. And it's like, I don't know. It's been a strange saga to be able to talk to when I lecture to conventional doctors, and they're like, well, you don't have Cushing's or Addison's degrees. And I mean, it's like, you know, are you rich or are you broke? Yeah. You know, what happened to the middle class? Like, what happened to all this space in between? And I think that's where it kind of lands, where, you know, we're looking at things and we're saying, if it's either got to be completely broke or normal. It's like, well, what happens if the car's just clicking? Like, why wouldn't I want to tune that thing up?
But that's kind of, you know, typically what you see across the board. And I'm not having to go conventional medicine here because I've gone past that stage of my life. I always joke, you know, it's when you get into your early 20s and you start watching the Zeitgeist movies, and you know, there's the whole Bilderberg group, and you know, the Rockefellers are ruling the world. And it's like conventional medicine, it's just all pharmaceutical, and they're just trying to kill everyone and don't eat any food, and you know what I mean? You get all angry, and then when you get into your late 20s and 30s, you start to mellow. So I'm just prefacing this that, like, I'm not completely anti-conventional medicine, but it does seem to be a common trend that, you know, if you're just within this range, you're fine. So the typical one is like blood sugar, for instance. You know, you could be getting your bloods done, you know, whatever, say even if you're just getting them done yearly, and they were saying, geez, your fasting glucose, it's going up linearly for the last 5 years, but you still haven't gone over the threshold of being diabetic, so you're grand. Do you know what I mean? As you said, so they kind of wait till things are completely just broken. So it seems to be the same case too then with the adrenals. It's either like, you know, do you have Addison's or do you have Cushing's? You know, are you not producing any, or are you completely overproducing? And then if it's anything in between, they don't seem to want to know about it. In regards then to testing, Jeff, I previously have done functional diagnostic nutrition, and I've done some stuff with Functional Medicine University. And I don't know if we spoke about this online on our last conversation. We might have spoke about it offline. Again, I kind of alluded to there, going through transition as a person myself, you know, saying, you know, in your early 20s, you learn all this stuff and you're getting angry. I said you mellow out. And kind of I've had a similar sort of journey with functional medicine, that when I was younger, I was like, oh yeah, I'll learn all these labs and I'll be the man, like, you know, I'll be a strength conditioning coach, and, you know, I'm a neuromuscular therapist, and now I'll have this functional medicine branch. And as I got older, I started to appreciate why my friends who were in conventional medicine, I started to appreciate why they actually got angry at like trainers who were doing functional medicine, because it was essentially like putting a gun in a baby's hand. Because like they think, oh, I know these functional medicine tests, and then it's like they've no clue about just basic physiology. Do you know what I mean? And they were just taught like these 3 or 4 tests, and then these like completely just, you know, cookie cutter supplement protocols to sell a shitload of supplements. So I kind of like got a bit, like disillusioned. I was like, you know what? I can actually see where my conventional doctor friends are coming from here. They're in their mind, they're like, listen, we're gone to school for like almost 10 years and we don't know this stuff. And you're here telling us you did a 6-month course in these functional lab tests and that you know what's going on with this person in terms of their adrenals or, whatever else they've got, this gut bacteria. And I'm not saying that stuff isn't useful or helpful. What I'm trying to say is, though, like because this was me. I was like, oh, I know more now than doctors. You know what I mean? That's just like,
Right.
no, you don't. You're dangerous. That's what you are right now.
You're dangerous. Yeah, you're dangerous. Again, it's a little different because when we talk about physical training, we're like, oh, okay, like everything is individual. So I'll know how to move a deltoid and I'll train your deltoid. And that doesn't really work with hormones. People are like, I'll treat the adrenal glands. It's like, well, okay, well, you'll probably screw up the HPA axis, right? If you just go on, and I've seen people, it's like, well, I'm just going to take a shit ton of hormone. And it's like, oh, we'll see where that goes. Like you're not, it's like a spider's web. You're pulling on one piece of it and the whole thing's going to move. And so we always say, well, if, there's no sense in balancing, I'll just go ahead and add more money into the system, right? I'll take a ton of pregnenolone, a ton of DHEA, and we just have no idea that, or, if we're not testing, we don't know, then it's like, well, you just made a ton of estrogen out of that. And instead of like, we're going to backfill your cortisol, just give you a bunch of adrenal supplementation. And it's like, well, what if the cortisol was high? Because everybody's giving adrenal supplementation, right? It's like, well, I'm just going to give you a ton of adrenal supplementation. It's like, well, why would you put more gas in the car when it's driving that fast? Like, well, why would you want to keep driving it to the point? Because if you keep doing that, invariably you're going to burn a nervous system out. And training, I see it all the time. That's true story. When CrossFit started, this was a million years ago again. I was in Calgary at the time, had a huge Canadian practice, and I saw a bunch of athletes, and James was just getting into CrossFit at that time. And I said, I wonder where this is going to go, this ballistic movement, this high lactate movement. And it's not to say it's bad. I'm just saying, I'm curious by nature. I want to see what the physiological effect of this is, because it looks pretty badass, right? Like this doesn't look like we're touching our toes. I'm watching these 2-a-day workouts and I'm like this is like taking a greyhound and running it as fast as you can around the track, chasing the rabbit. And it's like, when does it stop? And so we got this company to do salivary hormone tests. And it wasn't like just a normal cortisol. I was like, okay, well, what happens? Because when you train, you want to get an increase in cortisol. If you don't get an increase in cortisol, there's no sense in training because you're not going to respond to that. That's the normal response. You're trying to get an increase in training. And I took all these athletes that were CrossFit-ish, I guess we'll say, and I measured all of them. And I'm going to say 70% of them couldn't respond to that exercise. And this wasn't CrossFit that was doing it. These were these athletes that would pick CrossFit to kind of say, I need to do the latest, greatest thing, right? I'm kind of maxed out on whatever training I'm going to do. And I want to go do something completely ballistic to just destroy myself so that I can feel good about the day. And we saw that, that, look, there wasn't a great response to ballistic training unless you knew what you were doing. Right. And I think I did probably 50, 60 tests, and I only measured salivary cortisol's response at, we'll say, first thing in the morning. Then they did exercise and I measured the response, and then I measured DHEA, and we looked at it and we're like, wow, these aren't 60-year-old people. Like these are 20-year-olds. And we really saw a lot of adrenal dysfunction just from training. The diet was, these, right? These people, the diet's good, right? The diet looks good. They're going to sleep when the sun goes down. We had all kinds of good stuff on pieces of paper. But if you didn't check physiology, you really didn't have an idea what you were doing. And if you were taking all these supplements and you still didn't check physiology, you still didn't know what you were doing. And I think that's, back to your point of saying, what can we just load everybody with this stuff? Are we not to test it? Are we not to test it because we're not doctors? Doctors don't test it, right? They're just like, you come in, you're tired. They say you might be depressed. Here's an antidepressant. Or you might be tired. And it's like, it's always dumbfounding to me because I get lots of referrals from doctors, and they look at these people and they look like Adonises, right? They're say on paper, they're like, doc, on paper, there's nothing that I can suggest to this person, right? I'm looking at their diet. It's It's good. Their sleep, their lifestyle, air, water intake, everything looks good. But this person really cannot function, in life. And I say, well, here's what you want to do. You want to go ahead and dip into endocrinology. And then they say, whoa, 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 whoa. That's an endocrinologist's job. And I'm like, okay, well, let's go ahead. Here's what's going to happen. And we do a test. So there's tests, right? Blood tests for cortisol are useless. You have to be really, really down the road if you want to get a low blood cortisol, because cortisol is supposed to be high first thing in the morning. And then it's supposed to get lower as the day goes along. So measuring a 1-point hormone for that gland with cortisol doesn't tell you much. You can wake up in the morning. You can get out of bed. You might be able to shuff around for the first hour, and then you are in bed for the next 23. I promise you, you still might be able to produce something when I do that blood test in that first hour. But it is not reflective of 90% of the day. And it was a weird thing to look at.
Is it more bound to blood cortisol?
Well, cortisol will really start coming up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So the first thing, people are like, look, I wake up from 2 to 4 in the morning. I poke my head out of the gopher hole and I go to bed. I can go back to bed. That's the first sign that the cortisol is on its way up, and then it's going to crash down hard. Just like blood sugars. I eat something, I come up, I come down. That's just like cortisol. And it goes from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, and then it's supposed to stay high, and then it's supposed to come down lower during the day because cortisol inhibits metabolism. It also isn't that great for testosterone. So when you get up in the morning as a caveman, you're supposed to be freaked out. You're supposed to say, God, like, what am I going to do today to stay alive? And then as you kind of get your day done, that cortisol is going to drop down, and it needs to drop down because thyroid hormone elevates later in the day, and it's supposed to be your main metabolic gland. And if cortisol is still around when thyroid is around, thyroid hormone will not work because cortisol is king. Cortisol will beat testosterone. Cortisol will beat thyroid hormone. Cortisol will be insulin. Cortisol will beat anything, any time of the day, because it is the main hormone for survival, and your whole goal is survival. So if you train, I always say, people say, well, what's the best time for me to train? And I'll say the morning, because you have cortisol and testosterone. A lot of people socially, that's not okay. So they'll train right after work, right at about, 7, 8 o'clock at night. They'll do this huge lactate load, and they'll have these cortisol levels that extend way into the evening. And the problem is, again, growth hormone is really produced from, we'll say, midnight to 2 a.m. and we'll miss that. So we're separating. Cortisol will just trump every other hormone that we have. And sooner or later, when we don't get these other hormones kind of in sync, all we have is cortisol. And when that cortisol runs out, then we don't have cortisol. And then all we have is adrenaline. And when the adrenaline runs out, because you're hitting the monsters and you're hitting the caffeine, then we have nothing. And that's when they end up on my table or in these chairs, and we'll say, that is not adrenal fatigue, because medically you didn't have a disease. Yeah. Functionally, you broke that thing down. So it's terminology is a bad thing in medicine because it's textbook. We call it school medicine. That's not like it has nothing to do except belong in textbooks.
Just going back then to the testing. So we have blood, urine, and saliva. Can you maybe just give the listeners a bit of a breakdown of each one and the pros and cons of each one?
So blood is only 1-point testing. Like I said, it's pretty bound up. It's in the bloodstream. We only have 5 liters of blood. So to be able to test anything in the bloodstream is only really production. Can you do it at this time? It doesn't really relate to what your cells are doing, and it doesn't relate to what's in your tissue. And medically, I mean, we like to just pick these certain tests and roll with them. When we, perfect example is cholesterol and heart disease. We like to roll with that. And after like 50 years of not being able to decrease heart disease, we'll still stick with that model. And blood work is like, you can have stage 4 anything, and your blood work can still look quite normal. And in the world of hormones, again, it's not a great way to measure it because it doesn't measure what's getting into the cell, and you have no. The beauty of hormones is to know what they're doing for the entire day, not necessarily what they're doing at one time. Who cares, right? The boogeyman jumps out at me. I get scared. You do my blood work. I'm probably going to crank something out, right? I'm probably going to be able to crank some hormone out. So then it would be in the normal ranges, but it won't reflect the rest of the day. Saliva is pretty good. I like Saliva. So it used to be the only thing available because it'll actually give you what's in the tissue, in a certain sense. And you can do normally a salivary cortisol. You'll go through what the variation through the day is. So you'll do a first morning cortisol, noon, 4 p.m. before you go to bed. Pretty good in the tissue. Urine, which is the most expensive, but probably one of the better ways or the best way to do it, because you get metabolites too. You get to see, hey, I don't want to see what's only in the tissue. I want to see what I used during the day and what I excreted. So it's a pretty decent way, because sometimes you have a lot of hormone in the system, like with the salivary test, but you can't use any and none comes up. And so it's like, okay, it tells me it's there, but it didn't necessarily tell me what I spent during the day.
Yeah.
And so I would say blood work is kind of useless for this, right? For cortisols. I think it's interesting sometimes. I'll measure some people's cortisol and they'll be low, and it's cheap. It's easy to do. But really, if you want to have a good look at it, you'll go to saliva or urine.
And maybe then, I know that when I used to do some of the saliva tests, adrenal stress index, we used to have these 3 phases of adrenal dysfunction, they'd call it, so you were overproducing it, then you were producing a sufficient amount, but the rhythm of it was all wrong, and they were calling that phase 2. And then phase 3 was when you were just tanking out. Now, again, I don't know how much stock you put into that sort of categorizations. And then also there was always the DHEA to cortisol ratio was a big thing too. And then they often look at the other hormones, the estrogens, testosterone, and melatonin. So just in regards to the salivary testing there and the 4 points over the course of the day, could you maybe just, elucidate the listeners to that?
Yeah. So again, the cortisol is supposed to be highest in the morning and then go down during the day. And so the good thing, when they put these things into 4 quadrants, right? So they said, hey, quadrant 1 is a normal response. Cortisol goes up, DHEA. Remember, cortisol is the gas pedal, DHEA is the brake, right? Cortisol break things down, DHEA will build things back up. So as we kind of go through these functions and we say, if I continue to break something down, obviously this phase 2 would then be cortisol goes up and DHEA says, wait a second, I'm going to have to spring into action here because the lion's jumping out a little bit too much. So now DHEA comes up. All of a sudden then phase 3 ends up being cortisol stays high for so long, for a longer period of time because I'm intensely training or I have lots of stress or I'm going through a divorce or whatever you want to pick. I have a chronic illness and DHEA can't stay in the race. So your body has to say, we have to make a decision here. This guy is still in trouble. So we're going to keep running cortisol and we're going to have to get rid of these anabolic hormones because we don't have enough resource to feed everybody. So we're going to keep with this, keep with these anti-inflammatory hormones. And then the 4th stage is the race is done, endocrinology wise, you can't keep up with it. It's not an infinite resource, and when we're young, again, everybody going through puberty understands you have more hormone. And then after that, it gets budgeted pretty good. And by the time you hit stage 4, I don't necessarily like to put people in there. I like to look at the numbers a little bit more because the numbers, that's based on kind of total values, the sum of totals in there. And if you can have normal quadrant testing, but have this huge elevation of cortisol before you go to bed. And I'd say that's way more dysfunction than anything. And so, people that want to do, they just I want to do adrenal support. If the person has high cortisol and high DHEA, you have to actually decrease what's happening in the adrenal gland. You might have to treat the nervous system, or you might just have to have a flat out talk with that person. You don't want to add gas onto the fire and say, I'm going to keep driving this thing. And I think that's, anytime you train, you're going to get a cortisol response. If you train hard, you're going to get a bigger cortisol response. For females, if you train on your cycle, you're not going to get DHEA. You're not going to get, so you can put yourself in, we'll say, a hypercortisol state pretty easily. It's trying to get out of that cortisol state fast enough where you don't tire out that gland to the point that it can't produce cortisol. Because everybody says, well, high cortisol. I'm like, high cortisol is still way better than no cortisol.
Yeah.
It's just not great for training because you never get to get metabolism and you don't build lean muscle mass with high cortisol. Your body says, I'm freaking out here. Muscle isn't the greatest source of energy, so I'm just going to start depositing fat. Because if this guy is that concerned and running away from a lion all of a sudden and then runs into this protein bar, I would rather just put that in the stores for later. So cortisol then will say, well, let's go ahead and deposit fat. The best place to deposit fat is around the midsection because it's the hardest to get at. So in order, when we're starting this, when we're looking at these clients, we'll say, and we say like, how are we going to lose weight? Or if I'm doing this workout and it's not translating to something, then unfortunately, yeah, you have to look at the hormones. If it's past dietary at that point. I always say, is it external or internal? And if you're not getting effects from something, then we'll look at endocrinology and we'll pick thyroids, adrenal glands, and reproductive organs, and we'll have to look at all those. So when we're having these conversations, and we're saying, we're kind of getting this, we're looking at these monotherapies saying, I'm only going to look at adrenal glands. It's like, danger, danger. And I think, again, that's where in the world of conventional versus alternative medicine, we're doing conventional medicine if we only look at adrenal hormone because we're specializing. Yeah. We're only specializing something.
Just, we've had this conversation on our previous podcast, and it's something that myself and James have often spoke about. And it's not even just limited to conversations that me and James have, or what we spoke about on our previous podcast. But again, and I suppose, this kind of comes up nearly in every podcast nowadays, it seems, when I'm speaking with other practitioners and coaches within sort of the sports performance field, and then the sort of health and health, wellness, longevity field. So some people might roll their eyes and go, oh, he's going to talk about this again. But that's the sort of